Welcome to task 1. The purpose of this task is to introduce you to arrays. So we have chosen an example which makes it difficult, if not impossible, to create a program without arrays. Imagine you have a class with hundreds of students. You are required to store their names and their marks and do some processing with them. Obviously, if you were to declare separate variables, you're going to require hundreds of separate variables. It can become really cumbersome. In the second part, we will select those students whose marks are in the specified range, in this case 50 and more, and we will just display only those students. So we will now fire up Eclipse. I go to week 5 and I create a new class. And I call it marks processing just to be meaningful. So the thing I need to do here is not declare variables as before, but to declare arrays. I want to store student names as well as student marks. Therefore, I will need 2 arrays. But before I create an array, I need to specify the number of elements I can store in them. So the first thing I need to do is to prompt the user to enter the number of students in the class. So in order to do that, first I create a scanner object by using the new right. Once I have a scanner object, I'm able to read things, and it's telling you need to import the library. So I will prompt the user to enter the number of students in the class. So as the user enter, I'm going to store that in a variable. I declare a variable called student, or rather number of students. Right. Now that I know the number of students in the class, so you notice it's complaining there's an out missing here. It's a good thing about using Eclipse, but it also adds things for you when you don't want it. Okay, so I'm going to have to declare 2 arrays, and I know the number of elements I require because it's based on the number of students in the class. So in Java, arrays are accessed by references. So first I need to declare a reference. So you can give it any name you like. So I'm just going to call it names. So you notice the moment you put a square bracket sign, the compiler knows you are dealing with the array reference. This time you notice I'm creating an array of references. So inside this array of references, you can store the reference to various string objects. So I need to specify how many such references I require. Obviously, this depends on the number of students. So effectively, I'm creating an array of, let's say, 5 array references. Right, once I have done that, I can do the same thing for marks. So this time you notice I've declared an reference to an integer array rather than a string array, and here I'm going to use a new int square bracket number of students. Right, you notice that it's been complaining all this while. I have declared this wrongly as string array of string references. So once I have got that, okay, I'm ready to go now. Just to summarize what we have seen so far, I have constructed an array of string references which can store up to num student references. Similarly, I've constructed an array of integers which can store that many different marks. Now, all I'm going to do is use a for loop to ask the user to enter that many times the marks to be stored. So let's say the number of students So last week we studied about for loop. For loop is easy to use. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this and paste because instead of me typing it. So all I'm going to do is ask the marks first, enter name for student plus, I'm going to put here I plus 1 because your I starts at 0. So it will go from 1, 2, 3 instead of 0, 1, 2, 3. Right. So in response to this, student is going to enter the name of first student, second student, and so on, which I'm now going to store inside the array. You notice to store something inside array, you write names. You need to specify which particular element you want to store. So this time again we are using a square bracket sign. Inside here will be either 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. But because we are inside a for loop, we can actually use the variable itself, the control variable itself as the index. So here again I'm going to use a next method instead of next line, because if you have next line you will end up problems with buffering and so on, right? So I'm going to say enter first name rather than the whole name, and here it should be first name for student rather than students, one at a time. Right. So then I'm going to do exactly the same thing, asking the person to give the marks for that student. So the only difference is enter mark rather than first name. Right. So the array name is going to be marks rather than names. And obviously this I should be using int rather next int. Right, done. So if you are reading a string only without spaces or tabs, then you could use next, and it saves you a lot of trouble with buffering and so on, which we will come to later. Right. So I have basically written a program that will read any number of students and read them one by one and storing them inside two arrays whose sizes we requested the user to specify. So in the second part, as you saw, we want to print the names and marks of those students in a particular range. I could do that using a separate for loop. As before, it's going to be integer I equal to 0, I less than num students. So all I'm going to do this time is not going to print all the student names and marks, but rather only those who meet that criteria which says they must have passed the test. So as before, as we saw in the last couple of weeks, we can use a if to select that. So what I'm saying now is if the marks of that students lie between, say, it's more than 50, let's say it's not going to be more than 100, then I will be printing that name for that student as well as the mark for that student. So if marks square bracket I. If this happens to be greater than 50, I'm simply going to print both the name and the mark for that student. So I'm just going to use the array names. Remember, you notice here, whenever you are referring to individual element in the array, you need to specify which element are you referring to. As you guess, I starts with 0. The first time round it will be 0. The next time round will be 1, as I goes up by 1 each time. And on top of that, I also want to print the marks of that student. So I give a space in between and I put marks I, right? And pretty much that's all we're going to do, right? Write a program that can store as many student name and marks, first name and marks, and then basically go through them, iterate through them one by one and check if the mark for that particular student is greater than 50. I should put greater than equal to 50 because 50 is also a pass. Then the program will just print the names and marks. So let's see what we have got so far. So let's run this program. So let's say I have only 5 students in the class. I'm not going to enter 500 student names and marks. So let's say this is Charles. I could have given a space so it would have read better. Charles. And let's say the marks for me is 34. Let's say Guyan. And let's say it's 98. Let's say it's Paul. And marks is, let's say, 99. And marks for student 4. First name, Mercy. And let's say it's 100. And first name, let's say Riza, and let's say it's also 100. So you notice that what it has done is basically print out only those who scored about 50, which in this case is everybody except Charles, Guyan 98, Paul 99, Mercy 100, Riza 100. You notice, however, they all came out in the same line simply because I use print rather than print line. So that's not really a major issue. So you notice the marks I entered for Charles, because it is less than 50, neither Charles nor his marks are printed out. Everybody else who scored 50 and more is printed out. So that concludes this section. Just to summarize what we have seen is that if we are going to store more than one element, whether it's 2 or 5 or 500, we can use an array. We can create an array to specify how many elements do we need. It's almost the same as using a variable, except that whenever you are referring to an element, you need to specify which element by placing the index inside square brackets, right? So this part is the same. We use the next rather than a next line because if you are reading it in a keyboard, sometimes it eats up the new line and gets you into trouble. And then as before, I've used a next int, and I'm just storing it instead of mark 1, mark 2, mark 3, I'm storing it inside the array, and the index as it runs from 0 to 1 less than the last element. For example, if there are 100 students, it will basically go to 99. Just in addition, just to say that you don't need to specify, let's say if you don't know the number of students, you're going to do it for every element in the array. You could actually specify the name of the array. Let's say it's names, or it could even be marks. There is an attribute that is provided called length. So if you say names.length, it knows exactly how many elements are there, and it will go through that number of times. So you will often find that useful to use that length of the array or the number of elements in the array, right? So if you run again, it would have no effect. It will be exactly the same. So this time let me run a program with only 2 students in the class. let's say the first one is Charles, who got 45 marks, and sorry, I made a mistake here. So let me run again because I entered Charles and 45 at the same time. So I run the program again. So number of students 2. Enter the first name for student 1, Charles. Enter the mark for student 1, 45. Enter the first name for student 2, let's say is Tio, and her marks is, let's say, 78. And you notice it only prints Tio and 78 because Charles scored less than 50. Therefore, his name or mark is not printed out. So that concludes this section.